Then we're going to go on to a presentation by Tommy Monday. He's going to be talking about reactive strength training, which I think is a topic to be using and to be in with our athletes as well. If they haven't got access to any kind of kit, working on like lighter explosive exercises to plyometric active strength training is definitely something that they can be working on.
Right, like Danny sort of said before, with this, we're the good thing about all these exercises, the plyometric exercises, the reactive strength work, is that it requires only your body weight. So I think this is a really key thing for a lot of sort of our athletes to be working on currently. So if we start off working backwards, sort of with boxers. So as a cruise sort of mentality, I think if we aim to shape training to allow the boxers to punch as hard and as fast as they want, when they want, as often as they want, you can't really go too far wrong. So essentially, give them the physical capacity to be technically and tactically great, and you can't really go too wrong. So reactive strength, I don't know if anyone's seen these videos of Werner Gunther, like massive man with a mullet, just absolutely like springing over these hurdles, but gives a really good example of what we're after today. So essentially, we're looking at plyometric ability, how sort of springy someone is, so how springy our boxers or combat athletes are. And we're looking at the effectiveness of the stretch shortening cycle, particularly through the tendons. So can we sort of load and explode and do it very, very quickly? So producing force within very short windows under 0.2 seconds. Primarily, the limiting factor towards this is the stiffness around the ankles and the tendons around there. And it's related to sprint and change direction performance in team sports, basically reducing the ground contact time. So I can cover set distance while spending less time on the floor, okay? And we're also going to look at how that can impact on footwork and punching performance. So essentially, it's primarily isometric contractions of the muscles, but tendon stiffness around the ankle is our limiting factor. So when we measure this, we look at the ratio of flight time to ground contact time, and we'll typically do that on the opto jump. So there's Danny measuring someone there. So we've got 4 athletes here. So we've got someone with basically an okay jump height. So the flight time indicating jump height, okay jump height, spends 0.2 seconds on the floor. They get an RSI score of 2.5. Someone else maybe spends that same amount of time in the air, but is able to produce that force to get up in the air by spending a lot less time on the floor. So their RSI score is higher, it's now 3.1. Someone else maybe even longer in the air, similar sort of time on the floor, and they get an even better RSI score. So we're basically looking at achieving a given jump height in less contact time, or essentially jumping higher for a given contact time. What you're essentially after is more force in less time, which is a key sort of performance indicator for punching hard. So when we assess this, hopefully this video works, we use something called a 10-5 RSI test. So that's low technical demand, and it makes sense to an athlete. We've used things like drop jumps before and stuff like that. We've used things like drop jumps before and stuff like that, but they tend to work less well. Whereas this, you say, do 11 pogo jumps, spend as little time on the ground as possible and jump as high as you can. And then we get a quick and reliable sort of insight into someone's reactive strength ability. So you can see this athlete here is trying to get as high up in the air as they can and spend as little time on the floor as possible. So we can do this via either the opto jump or video analysis. I typically use video analysis, and I'll use timestamps on my phone. So I'll film on an app where, for example, like My Jump or Dartfish or something, and then you can see the timestamps where people contact the floor, when they leave the floor and when they land again. So you're getting a good insight into someone's flight time, the jump height, and how long they need to spend on the floor to achieve that jump height. So in terms of applications to the punch now, so we're quite sort of big advocates from our research, the in-house stuff, and from what Danny released and what Alan released as well. The higher you can jump, the higher your potential is to punch hard and fast. Okay, so a lot of our program is making people try and jump higher. So that's because of an 80% association between jump height and punch force, which is what Danny and Alan found in their research. And in the other piece of research, we found lower body impulse and RFD, which dictate how high you can jump, are very correlated with punch impact force. So essentially, the higher you can jump, the harder your potential to punch. Now, when we look at this, we know that punches are delivered in less than 0.2 seconds, which if we go back to here, which is the sort of time frames what this athlete is spending on the floor. Obviously, we've slowed it down, but they're spending under 0.2 seconds on the floor. So we're essentially looking, can we produce a lot of force through the lower body, and can we do it extremely quickly? I don't know if anyone's seen this before. I should hope you have. But Stephen Smith knocks out Gary Buckland. I use this as an example a lot, I'll play it a couple of times, and then I'll sort of give my thoughts. And if anyone else wants to chip in here, just to give some thoughts, let the video run a couple of times, then we'll see what's what. Buzzing. So if I run that again. Slip, bang, uppercut, good night. Sound. So I've got some thoughts from there. If anyone wants to chip in, feel free to sort of unmute your mic and say anything. But I'm going to say how I think that reactive strength ability links in with that knockout. So essentially,
Did you use Stephen Smith because you're a Gallagher boxing fanboy? Absolutely,
yeah, absolutely. So essentially, this is how I communicate with boxers a lot in as to why we try and improve someone's reactive strength. So this is Stephen Smith's knockout here, and then we've got Anthony Fowler doing pogo jumps here, and it sort of illustrates the same thing. So Stephen Smith has slipped in this frame here, and he's loaded by turning his front knee in. He's loaded onto his back heel. Okay, so there's a lot of force going through that back ankle. And then he drives straight back up out of it, produces a lot of vertical force. He transmits that force through his lower body, his trunk, his shoulders, and then his fist, and then he redistributes it. So likewise, Fowler here, when he lands in a pogo jump, there's a lot of force going through that ankle, sort of controlling it and redistributing it to come straight back up. So it's essentially dip and drive. So we know with punching hard, the force and energy is transferred from foot to fist during a punch. So we've got to be able to control and recoil force very rapidly through the lower body muscles. And ankle stiffness is going to play a massive role in that from what we know about reactive strength. We want to make the time between sort of controlling and recoiling as small as possible and recoil as much force as we can. So we want to leak as little as possible. And in terms of thinking about that, in terms of RSI, that's making your ground to contact time as small as possible, and leaking it as little as possible is jumping as high as you can out of it. And we want to have the strength and mobility to transfer this force through the hips, the core, and the shoulders. Okay, so it's all well and good generating this force with your ankles, with your lower body, with your knees and your hips, etc. But if you're restricted through up here, you're not going to transfer that force too well. And also, the most important factor, you've got to be technically great. And obviously you've got to time it right. Okay, so going back to this, sort of my argument from here is not necessarily that Stephen Smith, right, he might not necessarily have well-developed RSI. We don't know that. We've not got the numbers to say it. But we can see in that video where he knocked Gary Buckland out, there's a lot of force going through the ankle, knee, hips, core and shoulder. And that's a sort of visual representation. Okay, so that's sort of the theory around the punch, but we need to research this more. In terms of applications of footwork, which is very important, obviously we're on the balls of the feet all the time when we're boxing. So we're essentially doing very small accelerations, sort of moving forwards and backwards, and decelerating to stop to move. So we want to sort of, in terms of that, we're either creating space in the ring. So that's essentially giving yourself a little bit of room to either throw shots or to have a little look, or you're trying to restrict space if you're cutting someone down. So essentially attacking or defending, being positive or negative. Footwork taking place primarily on the front third of the foot, like we said before. There's a horizontal and lateral movement, primarily not vertical. The vertical force coming when we're punching. We're using things like feints, little pushaways, step back on 1 or 2 feet. And you've got to do it very, very quickly with a lot of force, or the opportunities to throw these punches are missed. So drifting in and out of range as well. and the movements are primarily submaximal. So we're not doing these things generally as fast as we can. I've used Peter McGrail as an example because I think this gives a really sort of good visual representation of someone who's very, very in and out, very, very fast on the feet, and someone who's constantly being a nightmare to box against in front of his opponent. So very, very sort of a positive boxer coming forwards, but he's in and out all the time. And I want you to watch this clip. I'll run it through a couple of times. Might not be the best example, but watch the ankles and watch how much sort of, in theory, how much force is going through. So in and out of range. Quite an aggressive step back, give it a little bit of room. We'll run it through again. You saw a visual.
It's coming through quite slow, Tommy.
Oh, is it?
Going frame by frame, yeah. So yeah,
Apologies.
just add on that Peter McGrail thing. It's that when we did a workshop with Mark Campbell a few years ago, he was like saying about the different kinds of athletes that he works with, and somebody with a typical high RSI score that they see typically moves like this. And they said about Peter McGrail, and they used him as an example. So you using an example there is perfect because he's the one that's got the really high RSI scores on in relevance to the GB boxing program. So yeah. Perfect choice.
So to be honest, Danny, I'd forgotten about that, to be fair. So but you can, looking at sort of how much force goes through the ankles and how quick he's able to do it, you can probably predict that he'd have good RSI. So as well as be able to do these sort of maximal movements, these in and out, and the sub-maximal ones very, very quickly, we're also looking at something called, like, we'd call this like reducing the cost in other sports. So the ankle, the knee, and the hip extensors can basically handle more force, and they can handle it more quickly. So you could the McGrail, where he makes quite an aggressive step back to throw a shot off the back of it, he can put the brakes on with his ankles, and he can get into better positions more quickly. So he's essentially got more opportunity to throw better shots. All the movements submaximal pretty much, but it becomes even more submaximal with developed RSI. So we're essentially getting improved economy, and the essential cost of the movement, so how much energy and how much force it costs McGrail to do that, is lowered. So basically the tendons can handle and redistribute more force, requiring less muscular and metabolic effort. So that the essential is muscles are working less hard because the tendons can do a lot of the job. He's a very sort of elastic boxer, where he's quite tendon dominant. And there's strong evidence for improving the RSI in distance runners improves the running economy and reduces sort of the muscular cost. And then essentially a boxer like that with developed RSI would find the bout easier, especially moving around. So if we've got someone, these are a group of sprinters here, but Danny, just tell me if this comes through proper slowly, but if we've got a group of athletes that are really capable of producing very, very high RSI scores, and they don't need much time to get off the ground, then they're going to find this stuff a lot easier, where it's more submaximal, because what is submaximal becomes even more submaximal to them. So you can see here, sort of these athletes are able to spend barely any time on the floor and get off it extremely quickly. Very, very elastic. So typically how we progress plyometric movements, we get people landing, can you control and recoil force, in sort of slow stretch shortening cycle movements. I won't go into too much detail in this because I hope that we sort of know how to progress the plyometrics, but then starting to look at doing it rapidly. But typically, we can develop an already well-developed quality. So this stuff here, this would be sort of with any athlete, but we've got to remember that our boxers are typically very good at that kind of stuff already. So all the skipping and footwork they do, the stuff on the balls of the feet, they're probably okay in fast stretch shortening cycle performance. You can get them on stuff like Pogos quite quickly, and it's already a well-developed quality, but we just need to find ways of overloading it. So typically when we're looking at stuff like this, people tend to go for like sort of power, set and rep guidelines, which is sort of like 3 to 5 reps, 3 to 5 sets. But we can see here, this is data from one of our boxes, like our best reps are like sort of 7, 8, really good coming into their own. If we cut that set off at 5 here, then we're probably limiting the athlete's exposure to developing good RSI. So people can hold these good RSI scores for probably up to 20, 30 reps. Maybe like sort of 15, 20, 30 reps, like I say. And if you're cutting them off at number 5 by using sort of power guidelines, you're probably going to restrict their exposure and potentially limit their exposure to good RSI reps. So you want to give them as much opportunity as possible to sort of develop and show really good physicality.
Oh, what, man?
For that reason, we'll typically higher sets, more like 2 to 3 sets of 10, probably 3 or 4 times a week. So constant exposure to things like pogo jumps and hurdle jumps, just encouraging good RSI scores. In terms of progressing it, this is sort of like built on my sort of fairly limited experience of doing this stuff, like only being at it like 3 or 4 years really of doing plyometrics with people. But from sort of my crude thoughts, I'd start with speed, sort of low ground contact times, and then progressively add the height. And one thing that I've found to be really key is getting athletes in a really good rhythm. So just starting off, can you get off the floor nice and quickly? And then once you're good at doing that, start to add the height. So we're essentially looking at low ground contact times to start off with, and then adding the force production. Things like bounce, higher, faster, toes up, they tend to make a lot of sense to an athlete. Don't say light on the feet. I learned that very quickly. As soon as you say be light on your feet, which is often talked about, that slows down the ground contact time. And to make sort of less noise on the floor, people will spend too long on the floor. I'd say get good at a small number of exercises. With our boxes, we'll typically only use probably 5, 6 different plyometric exercises, but variations of them, and mastering the basics and getting really good at brilliant basics. So things like pogos, assisted pogos, where your hands on a barbell or something like that, overloading the movement, underloading it, and just giving the athlete as much opportunity as possible to express and show these good RSI scores. If possible, I'd use, and if I had access to it, I'd provide with augmented feedback all the time. So going back to, in fact, I won't go back to it, but going back to things like the jump mat, that provides RSI straight away. So driving intent and that being a teacher. And if you've got things like a push band, I think that you can use that to feedback on RSI. And identify sort of what's a priority for the athlete, like what's currently limiting their RSI score. If someone's getting good jump height, but spending too long on the floor, then you'll typically try and reduce their ground contact time. If their ground contact time's all right, but they just can't jump very high, encourage them to jump higher. So just identifying, is it force production or is it more stiffness? So probably seen stuff like this before. I won't go into too much detail, but this is really good, and we use this quite a bit to sort of, based on what someone's RSI score is, what should they be working on? And in future, so that's me wrapped up really, but in future, what we want to know is RSI related to more successful performance in boxing? And we're currently sort of doing some in-house research into that. So are better performers, do they demonstrate better RSI scores? If so, how does that work and why does that work? And what are the best ways to develop this quality in boxers? So thank you. And has anyone got any questions really? Thank you. So I've got, sorry, does Wilder also have a strong RSI, or is it just brute power from Thomas R? I wouldn't know. I've never, there's no sort of real measurement for that. Typically, what's I think Gary mentioned last week, and also what Danny mentioned with in terms of the different boxers' strength. You see better RSI scores in sort of lighter, faster boxers, and then in the heavyweights, they tend to be a little bit more force dominant. So they'd excel in something like a mid-thigh pull or a maximum deadlift, and typically would excel in that kind of stuff, whereas the lighter, faster boxers would have better RSI scores. Another thing we talked about was with the Duncan French of the USFC Performance Institute. He found that the Taekwondo athletes had really good RSI scores, and that's why they could sort of punch and kick very fast. Whereas your Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu athletes, the wrestlers and stuff like that, they didn't have as good RSI scores. So sort of typically how someone boxes, you can probably get sort of an inkling into that.
I think with Wilder as well, way that he generates so much power is, one, it's timing. It doesn't really land at like kind of full range, where he's got that such a long reach. He's got so much further to go when he actually lands, that is hitting them right at the kind of the peak of his tension in terms of length tension relationship. I would imagine that he has got like a good RSI, but he don't really show it that much within like kind of, right, that's why he's so powerful, because he's not really like kind of fast on his feet. He's not like stepping back and getting people onto the shots. It's like kind of them walking forward onto the shots as well. That's why it was such a shock that Fury decided that to box on front foot against him. So that's, you know, it's all kind of like making estimates just like based off the kind of athletes that you've worked with and see like kind of their performance as well within the ring. Tommy, good presentation. What would you say that the limiting factors are for somebody to improve their RSI?
What do you mean? So like, so what stops boxers from
what? Yeah. Well, what are the challenges for developing RSI for boxer?
So typically, because we're sort of in a sort of plantar flex position, we're on the balls of the feet, and we spend a lot of time on that. The ability for a boxer to pull the toes up and basically pre-stretch the ankle is very difficult because very often we're tight through the ankle and calves. So we'll typically pair this with like a lot of ankle mobility work to just try and encourage pulling the toes up in between reps. As well, like I mentioned before, it's already quite a good developed quality. So teaching, we do a lot of skipping. So teaching someone to, right, now it's not rhythm skipping, now it's intent, get off the floor quick, get up. That's often very, very difficult. So we've got to use like different ways of sort of challenging that. And then often it's fatigue. You can't really develop this stuff in a non-fatigued state. So it's picking a good time to develop your sort of speed and fast twitch qualities. Because if you're doing it in your second session of the day, that's probably not the best time for it. You say that's fair enough?
Yeah, definitely. I think a little bit similar to what Adam was saying when saying about focusing on mobility training as well. With the kind of reduced training loads in boxing, it's such a good opportunity for them to like develop speed and to loosen off as well. I'm going to bring in Dan Lawrence to discuss some of the stuff that you've been mentioning, Tommy, because I know that he has a range of different athletes that he's kind of done some testing on, doing some RSI with the jump band. With the push band, sorry. Dan, do you want to come in?
Yeah, great stuff. Firstly, great presentation, Tommy. Smash that, buddy. In regards to RSI, we do based off Dan Baker's research, we look at a 10% decrement on jump height. So this is more for measuring neuromuscular fatigue at the start of our sessions. I think we touched on, I came in late, but we touched on how we're monitoring fatigue and training loads, especially throughout this time, and especially once we get a fight date. We don't want our guys to be completely, pun intended, beaten up by the time we obviously have them fighting. So we use that as a measure of neuromuscular fatigue. We look at a 10% decrement, as I say, based off Dan Baker's work. We look at basic 5 to 10 jumps there with a dowel, but then more for the RSI, we use the 10-5 there as well, which is great. Definitely got some kind of experiences there with certain athletes on other ends of the continuum, so to speak. I'll say one of them because he won't mind, is John Ryder. So when we started with Johnny Ryder, I think anyone could probably tell he's an incredibly force dominant athlete just because of, you know, aesthetically and his makeup. So he was always very strong. We've now thankfully made his strength super strength. So I think Tommy presented that really well in terms of, look, it's not just about the amount of force you can produce. We're in a sport that's governed by how quickly you produce that force, or the rate of force development, so to speak. So for someone like John, yes, we made him stronger, great, increased high threshold motor units, that was good. But then the big win for us was to actually look at the other end of the continuum and look at RSI and look at ground contact times. And he was just spending way too long on the floor. We jokingly say John's nickname's the Griller. And I was like, now I know why we call you the Griller, because you literally spend so long on the floor. These 0.2 seconds or fast stretch shortening cycle of, was it below 250 is, they were nowhere near, you know, he's spending way too long on there. So we made that our kind of key area. And the improvements we've seen with John have been absolutely incredible. So back to kind of what you said, okay, and I suppose to give some context of how we can improve that as well, Danny, is, you know, looking at eccentric force absorption. A lot of these guys, again, low-hanging fruits are improve fundamental strength qualities, or the strength foundation, that they're not just bleeding energy on ground contact. We also look at, you were saying there, Tommy, yes, I agree, ankle dorsiflexion, ankle range of motion, big win without doubt, but we also want to be having range and have strength and stiffness through that newfound range as well. So looking at, you know, tibialis anterior to pull yourself up into dorsiflexion, we do a lot of work that I don't put loads up on, that is, yeah, tibialis anterior strength. We also look at bias in the calf, so we look at gastroc and soleus. We look at gastroc in a straight leg position. We look at soleus in a flex knee position to take the gastroc off stretch. And we look at soleus, especially as a contributor. Someone pull me up if I'm wrong on this, 60% of vertical force production goes through the soleus. So the soleus is super, super important in terms of that absorption of energy. We spoke before, Tommy, about running economy and, you know, ground contact times, etc. And the soleus is such a big one on that. So much so I've found lately my soleus is in absolute tatters because I've been doing more running myself. So I need to get a hell of a lot stronger through there. And to give the guys some context, we look at high load, super heavy, and we look at high reps. And that comes from my colleague James Moore at the Centre of Health and Human Performance, who works with the EIS, who's just like an absolute professor. He's ridiculously clever. Can't even hold a conversation with him, it's that bad. But anyway, that comes from him and a lot of the research he's done with a lot of these guys who are very springy and very elastic and very reactive. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
Dan, a lot of the time, typically like sort of closer to a fight day with John, are you typically working on what he's very, very good at, or do you target the speed stuff?
Yeah, good question, Tommy. If we only ever did what they were good at, there's a lot of uncharted territory of what we can make them better at to improve the overall athletic qualities that feed into the sport. I suppose it all comes with the needs analysis of what does that individual require, not just what do they enjoy. You know, he'd be doing bicep curls every session if it was something that he enjoyed, but that's not actually going to improve performance. So yeah, we do a very similar kind of concept of, you know, get them strong first, improve strength qualities after the preparatory phase of training for when they come back into camp. We do set an upper weight limit with some of them, and some of them come in over that upper weight limit. So the first couple of weeks is get a bit of tin off, you know, build some tolerance and capacity again through a preparatory phase of training. We then look at, improving upper limit of force production and strength stimulus. We then obviously surf the force velocity curve and look at more, you know, strength, speed, strength, and then look at more of the kind of reactive component. And that's where we've got a real big win, as I say, with John, Tommy. So we look at overspeeds, kettlebell swings, to give you some context around the exercises, pogos, ankling, though we did, and you had a great point there of keeping it simple with these kind of reactive drills. The ankling I've taken out of a couple of lads' programs because technical competency isn't good enough. And again, it's what are we trying to achieve? Well, we're trying to reduce ground contact times, make them reactive. Well, in essence, if they can't adhere to the technical model we're looking for, how are they producing force, and are they producing force rapidly? No, probably not. So if I just get them going hands on the hips and get them doing reactive pogos and ask them to, like you alluded to, so cueing is super important, get them to dorsiflex their ankle, because what we're trying to achieve is that rapid contraction of load to explode, so to speak. You know, what I say to them jokingly is we don't want to be like Michael Flatley doing the river dance with their toes pointing down in plantar flexion. That's not the optimal way to apply force into the ground. How are we going to apply force if we're like that? Is pitter patter. So we want to dorsiflex the ankle, get that elastic recoil, and produce force rapidly through that motion. So yeah, a good point of get the exercise. Again, what are we trying to achieve from the specific exercise? Don't just do these drills, because we might have seen some sprinters do these reactive drills, because our boxers, as we've spoken about many a time before, aren't technically competent through specific movements. It's like, are our boxers the best and most efficient runners? Absolutely not. So that doesn't then mean we can do these drills. Great out of camp or great as part of a warm-up, but primary objective is applying force into the ground and applying it rapidly. Probably go with the simple exercise as you alluded to.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, perfect.
Answer a question. Oh, sorry.
You want go on, Tommy?
I said, am I right to answer a question from the chat where it says for boxers would, because I think sort of me and Dan could have some decent input on there. It was from Thomas again saying for boxers would double unders on the rope be working that RSI? Yeah, but typically was when I'm first teaching the pogo, I'll say I want the rhythm off the floor like a double under. But what that tends to do is tends to encourage someone to pike their feet in front of them. As soon as you start piking your feet in front of you, you're no longer putting force vertically down into the floor. You're doing it horizontally. So what will and they'll end up sort of with the toes up in front of them, and you're doing that and you're restricting the foot going downwards. So it's about, can I put the force below me? Can I keep my feet below me and get my head high, rather than sort of overcoming that? But it's good sort of idea. What's your thoughts on that, Dan?
Yeah, no, I'd have to agree. Was that for me or Danny? Yeah, I'm Dan.
Both. You be Dan.
Yeah, great one. So like even on our pogos, we might draw a little line on the floor, a little X on the floor, and say, look, we want to keep you round or round about that marker to keep that vertical force application. So yeah, no, I'd have to agree. I try and differentiate the two in terms of skipping, double unders and all of that. It's again, everything we're doing needs to be outcome led. So it's like, is that the optimal strategy or exercise or way to reach the outcome? What is the outcome? Well, the outcome is high force and low ground contact times. I think we can reach that outcome in a more optimal way. You know, is it going to harm it? No, absolutely not. I'd say it may help, but it wouldn't be my go-to, so to speak.
Well, I'd just like to interject here, but what you're saying, Dan, about like kind of making it as simple as possible. How many times do we see across like kind of social media very high complex kind of plyometric drills that aren't actually going towards the adaptation? And I think a very important point is we want to focus on the adaptation and not the exercise. And maybe I sound a little bit of a hypocrite with that, with my recent plyometrics video where I'm upping about and everything like that, but I'm still maintaining that short ground contact time whilst doing it. And you've got to work your athlete through the gears. And I think one of the most limiting factors to that is the eccentric control. So you need to teach an athlete to be able to control force first, and then be able to kind of reproduce it. I'm going to bring Kian in here because he's got a question for Tommy. Kian, do you want to unmute your mic and ask a question?
Yeah, thanks, Danny. Just tell me, obviously the presentation is about boxing and stuff. I don't want to go too far away from it because I know like a lot of people in here train boxing and stuff, but I was just wondering, did you find your approach is similar with team sport athletes in terms of plyometrics? And do you find those that are higher in RSI with team sports, do they also perform the best? Or like, how do you find that? Do you find it has a big impact on team sport performance?
Yeah, definitely. And to be honest, the program that was sort of set out for me in terms of like plyometrics for football was often like sort of quite complex at the start, like a lot of hurdles, a lot of obstacles, a lot of drop jumps, things like that. And then we sort of moved away from that and went back to Pogos. I've got a lot of confidence in them, and I think just giving people like repeated opportunities to develop good RSI. And we've done Pogos all year, and we've seen massive improvements with the girls as well. The people that perform best on the 10.5 RSI and the people that develop their RSI the best were with the people who were sprinting the fastest, changing direction. We saw some good correlations between the flying 10-meter sprint time and also their RSI. So essentially, when they're sprinting, in theory, they're spending less time on the floor to achieve a given stride length. Another thing was essentially the people with, and this is sort of anecdotal, but from a squad of 20, the people that were displaying better RSI scores responded to different cues a little bit better. So essentially, the ones that were really, really good at RSI, they responded like, you know, any of our sprint drills, they responded really well to things like bounce and get off the floor quickly, and things like the floor's hot colds and something like that when they were sprinting. Whereas the ones with worse RSI scores, that didn't really make too much sense to them. So I think that if someone's displaying really good RSI, then you can probably cue things slightly different, because that's what sort of makes them tick as an athlete. But like I say, that's anecdotal. But I need to look into that a little bit more and probably get some numbers on it.
Thanks, Tommy. Appreciate it.
Good to see you.
You too. You too.
Danny, your mic's muted, bud.
Oh, bloody hell. I was going to say.
How could you tell I was speaking then? It's a good job, because I'll take it mick out of both Tommy and Kian talking too much then. Right, so we mentioned there about training the adaptation and not the exercise, and this is a big saying from the EIS, and I don't know whether we've got anybody else working from the EIS here, but I'm going to bring in Ash Downing, who's working with GB archery and para archery. What kind of the measures take, like, kind of, I know EIS is quite standardized across most of the sports. What are the kind of key performance indicators that they take from RSI?
Cheers, Danny. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sweet. Yeah, obviously I work in archery, so I don't do tons of this kind of stuff day to day, because it wouldn't make any sense for archery. But yeah, they kind of use a lot of force plates as well for data analysis and things. So do a lot of profiling on the force decks to measure like ground contact time and ground reaction forces and things. So there's a force decks in every single EIS site, so they're constantly measuring that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's the main ways. People use velocity-based training a bit as well with gym awares, so that's used a little bit. So yeah, so that's quite a common one. And like you said, yeah, training the adaptation over the exercise is massive. So we do a lot of stuff on the force decks, especially even training on the force decks sometimes as well. Like you were talking about before, I think quite a few of you mentioned the intensity as well around like measuring the exercises that you're doing to get the numbers and to create that intent. Obviously, Danny, you do that loads with the velocity-based training stuff as well. Like if you don't know the numbers, you're kind of just guessing all the time, and then that can motivate the athletes quite a lot. So I think showing the numbers is pretty important. I was gonna just touch on Soleus as well, as Dan was talking about. I think that's something that's missed out quite a lot, and we do loads of Soleus work as well, and even measuring that on the force decks, not in terms of reactive strength index, but in terms of just force production from the Soleus in bent knee position and things like that, and then measuring gastroc in straight leg on the force deck. So I think that's, if you're just doing straight leg calf raises or something, for example, and you're not training Soleus from a force production point of view or capacity point of view in bent leg and stuff, that's something that's quite important to kind of chase both aspects of that calf complex. And then yeah, I was just going to ask a couple of questions actually. One was around like upper body plyos, like whether you do any of that kind of stuff as well, and obviously talking about ground contact times and the calf complex, but whether you do anything from a upper body point of view. Then I was also you obviously mentioned that you don't want to pike your feet to create any kind of horizontal forces, but would you not want to train kind of horizontal plyos to a certain degree as well, if you think about kind of covering ground in that horizontal direction? Like you said, you're either moving away or you're moving back. So you've obviously got vertical plyometric drills that you can do, but do you do any horizontal drills, or what's your kind of thoughts for everyone really on doing more of that type of stuff as well?
Yeah, we'll do like sort of like horizontal broad jumps, things like that, and then sort of drop jump where into a horizontal jump, things like that. We do a lot of that, and in some of it with the boxers as well, just to sort of and also some lateral stuff as well. So we are looking at good RSI scores in different directions. So once we're sort of good at doing the pogo, we're now looking at, can we do it in different directions as well. But in terms of that, the not piking the feet, so that's sort of like not restricting the downward force. So just making sure that everything goes downward in that specific pogo jump movement. But once they are good at it, we'll open it up into different directions, get people sort of off one leg, progressing the ice skaters, all different things like that, horizontal drop jumps, a lot of stuff like that really. And then was there another question? Sorry, Ash.
Yeah, I was asking about like whether you do any upper body plyos as well.
Oh yeah, apologies. Not too much. Upper body ballistic work, yeah. And a lot of med ball throws, especially with the boxers, but not too much upper body plyos. I think there's different ways you can do that, isn't there? But I've not really done loads of it. We've not really done too much of it with the boxers, but there's probably some good stuff you can do. What about yourself with the archers?
No, we don't do any plyometric work. The way that the sport works, it's a very weird sport, and although there's like a really fast execution, it's not really a plyometric in itself, or not overly working stretch shortening cycle in terms of like a high force, high speed kind of thing. So it's a bit of a strange sport to explain really, but no, we don't do any of that type of work. We do a lot of specific stuff on the bows for a different purpose, but not really from that point of view. Yeah, I was interested as well. I was just going to ask, I'm just thinking out loud, but do you do any kind of like slow plyos as well, like 0.4, 400 millisecond kind of work, or is it all kind of, you know, your fast stretch shortening stuff, you know, below 0.2?
So this will be worked concurrently. So most warm-ups, there'll be a slow stretch shortening cycle movement where we're looking at things like we're probably doing like a counter movement jump or sort of a depth jump, where we're doing a counter movement jump off a box as soon as we hit the floor. So just expressing that, allowing that little bit more time to develop the force through 3 different joints as well: the hip, the knee, and the ankle. And then typically, so they'll typically be a like sort of slow stretch shortening cycle movement, and then there'll typically be a fast stretch shortening cycle movement in most warm-ups as well. And that's probably done as well, even though going slightly off topic, that's probably done all year round. With the boxers, no matter sort of what block they're in, they're probably doing this stuff all year round.
Yeah, I'd agree on that point there, and we definitely go with slower stretch shortening cycle work in the kind of preparatory phases, more as a neural primer and a potentiator of the central nervous system, just to feed into the session. But I'd also agree we do the fast stretch shortening cycle work, I wouldn't say directly at the start of camp, but after the initial preparatory phase of training, I'd absolutely, like, again, John Ryder is a case in point, I'd be putting some pogos into his warm-ups, and then we just increase over time. We'd increase the volume and amount of ground contacts throughout camp in that given session once he's built up the capacity and tolerance. And it's really interesting to see, like, great Ash as well that you guys do the Soleus. I'd love to see some of that. That'd be awesome. But you can actually really just coach his eye, see the improvement in terms of the elasticity from the first day of camp up until the peaking of pre-fight as well. It's really interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
And actually, I'll touch on your upper body as well. We won't go down the rabbit hole of true plyos and ballistic and the difference and all of that, but it's harder with the upper body, obviously, to monitor the duration of contacts. And we look at like overspeed plyometric push-ups. So where we put the band around the hips just to kind of increase the eccentric duration, and then can make them a little bit more reactive. We also look at medicine ball work as well, as Tommy alluded to, like in the supine position. And I might get involved as well by dropping the ball and varying the speed the ball comes down. So it's not just a matter of them pushing it up. I actually then might give it some leverage and push it down, so they then have to produce a more rapid firing rate in terms of the contraction. Again, how much force they're producing from that given movement, we you know, that's very much either a priming exercise or as part of a taper phase, to be brutally honest.
Yeah, just on that, Dan, it's very difficult to gauge like kind of that kind of ground, what we'd call ground contact time for the upper body plyos, but also gauging like kind of what kind of eccentric stress we could give for upper body movement, because we could go, if we did just a simple kind of med ball chest pass, we need to be able to overload that eccentric, and it's mostly it's a concentric movement. You got to try and find different ways, whether that's like you giving it some leather, but also like using bands as well. So doing the doing the banded chest med ball chest pass, it's like that overspeed eccentrics on that. Also like plyometric press ups. That's a tough one to kind of gauge, because I use basically I do most of the plyometric press ups from the bench rather than the floor, because from the floor it's very hard for them to get their arms into position, and it's a lot of force coming down for them to be able to control and then reproduce a lot of force. So taking them kind of more of an inclined angle will give enough eccentric stress there for them to be able to control and then reproduce that force, rather than like kind of like going it all the way from the floor where they're probably going to be overloaded, the hips are going to drop, they're probably going to go into like kind of like a little bit of a worm to try and get as much power as they can. So yeah, it's you've just got to kind of use your coach's eye, really. There's not much kind of like data that you can track. You've just got to make sure, right, is this challenging them eccentrically, and are they keeping good form, good posture, and are they getting powerful movement? And you know, 9 times out of 10 you'll be able to ask your athlete and they'll be able to give you enough feedback. Touching on the horizontal plyometrics, if you just take a vertical kind of movement such as like Pogos or fast Pogos on the floor, and then just kind of moving forward in a line drill, then you get some good kind of adaptation for horizontal plyometrics. We also think about sprinting. You know, that if we're doing sprints with our athletes and short ground contact there, a lot of horizontal forces. So we get most of our kind of horizontal short ground contact times from the maximal sprints on the curve, and also doing running mechanics, doing ace skips, doing falling starts, 5 meter accelerations as well. And you know, so when you know, Tommy asked the question, do we really do horizontal plyometrics? We don't do it in a strength and conditioning point of view. We do it mostly like as in a warm up to prepare them for maximal sprints on the curve. So really we've got that covered in them sessions. So in the strength and conditioning sessions, we can more focus on that kind of that vertical force production. Okay, has anybody else got any more questions? Because I'm gonna round it up there, because it's an hour, and we went on for an hour and a half last time, and it was a little bit too long. So has anybody got any final questions? Adam Cartel.
Hello, thank you for the opportunity. I don't know if it's really suits to this topic. Does it make any sense to make some kind of test with the RSI, not with ground contact time, but with heavy back contact time? For example, throwing 10 punches on the heavy back and to define there the RSI through the heavy back contact time?
That's really difficult. I think I mentioned before, like, is sort of like my lasting thoughts and sort of next steps. I think looking at how this relates to the punch, I think that's something along those lines is a really good idea. I wouldn't personally be able to come up with anything, but so that's very, very specific as well. But sort of we've got a good idea that generally what will limit performance in that test would be the RSI through the ground contact on the ground and through the ground contact through the ankle. So what would limit performance in a test like that would probably be something like that. So I think it's a really good idea, and I think it'd be interesting to see if the two things sort of lined up together. But like I say, sort of that's very specific, and I think this sort of general standpoint on RSI would explain performance in that test. Does that sort of make sense, Adam? Yeah. All right. Thank you for the question. Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Um,